Hi everyone, welcome to my channel, and today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. What keeps a marriage going when there's no love, trust, or basic respect? Some try to hold the family together for the kids, others fear public judgment and care about others' opinions, while some are stopped by religious beliefs or a mix of these factors. But sometimes, the desire to save a marriage at any cost can turn into a horrible tragedy. The story of Jacqueline and Paul Crimble isn't unique, but it drew widespread attention due to its cruelty, greed, and cynicism. The criminal was dubbed the Black Widow and put behind bars, but her daughter confessed in a candid interview that her mother continued to ruin lives even while in prison. The relationship of Jacqueline and Paul Crimble. Jacqueline, or just Jackie Mary Bennett, was born on December 18, 1974, in County Armagh, Northern Ireland, as the youngest of two children in an ordinary middle-class family. From childhood, she was erratic, spoiled, defiant, and sometimes even aggressive. In her teenage years, Jackie's behavior got worse, becoming completely unmanageable, but her family blamed it on adolescence, hoping she'd grow out of it. In high school, she met Paul Crimble, who was 3 years older and her complete opposite in every way. But as they say, opposites attract, and this principle seemed to work perfectly here. Paul was a modest and shy young man from a religious family, a good student, considered very talented and promising. Jacqueline's boldness, energy, and confidence attracted him. She was the first, and likely the only girl he had serious feelings for. Jackie's parents approved of her choice and welcomed Paul, believing he would make their daughter more calm, sensible, and reasonable. Sometimes it seemed like her family treated Paul better than Jackie herself, accepting him as a family member from the day they met. However, Paul's parents were cautious about his choice but didn't stop the young couple's relationship. School friends also noted that the couple seemed incompatible. Jackie often provoked conflicts, preferring to solve them with physical force, while Paul tried to resolve everything peacefully, avoiding violence, and was considered friendly, open, and very responsible. He always kept his word and was ready to help others at any moment, described as a kind, sensible, and mature young man beyond his years. At 17, Jacqueline got pregnant by her boyfriend and immediately told him. At that time, she was in her final school year, and 20-year-old Paul was already a college student. Upon learning this, Paul immediately declared his readiness to marry her and take full responsibility for her and the child. Jacqueline wasn't ready for family life or raising a child, but terminating the pregnancy was out of the question. Neither Paul nor his religious family would allow such a grave sin. So Paul bought a ring and officially proposed to Jackie, who accepted. The couple had a modest wedding in 1992, celebrating with their closest family and friends. Interestingly, a few days before the event, Paul confessed to his best friend that he and Jacqueline were too different in every way, doubted the sincerity of her feelings, and was even afraid of her due to her temper. The groom also doubted whether he truly loved her or just felt sympathy and a sense of duty, but since he never had relationships with other girls, he had nothing to compare. His friend listened attentively and tried to dissuade Paul from marrying, warning him that he might make the biggest mistake of his life and be unhappy forever. However, Paul was determined, saying he couldn't leave a girl expecting his child. Besides, he believed that motherhood would change Jacqueline's character for the better, making her softer and calmer. In general, Paul hoped for the best, but he had no idea how wrong he was. Family life without love. In early 1993, the young couple welcomed their first child, a daughter named Danielle. 6 years later, Jacqueline gave birth to their son, Adam. Paul was the sole provider for his family, ensuring they lacked nothing. After the birth of their second child, the Crimbles decided to find a more spacious home and purchased a cozy 3-bedroom townhouse in Armagh, moving in 2000. By then, Paul held a senior mechanical engineer position, earning a solid salary. His wife, however, did not trouble herself with work, claiming she preferred managing the household and raising the children. However, she was not particularly good at either. Jackie was selfish, lazy, quick-tempered, and often showed aggression even towards her children. When the children grew a bit older, Jacqueline tried to find a job, but her quarrelsome and confrontational nature meant she never stayed employed for long. Furthermore, she spent nearly every evening at bars, consuming alcoholic drinks while her husband remained home with their daughter and son. Even when sober, Mrs. Crimble was not the most pleasant person, and under the influence of alcohol, she turned into a real fury. She not only provoked conflicts but also engaged in fights, used foul language, and behaved inappropriately with various men. Any remarks or requests to behave more modestly were met with aggression, and no one could predict what she might do next. Neighbors and family friends were aware of what was happening and genuinely felt sorry for Paul and the children, who suffered the most from Jacqueline's antics. Since the family lived in a small, quiet town, many people knew about the young woman's escapades and tried to avoid her. Her bad reputation affected her husband and children, who faced repercussions from peers at school. Jackie led a wild lifestyle without trying to hide it, frequently visiting entertainment venues. However, her presence there frightened not only other patrons but also the staff, who knew that her arrival inevitably meant a conflict or fight. Jacqueline kept her family in fear because she could lash out at them at any moment. Paul tried not to complain about the situation, but his friends, family, and colleagues noticed his discomfort around his wife, or even just mentioning her. He was often advised to leave this woman, but Paul feared losing the chance to see his children. In any argument, Jackie would immediately threaten to cut him off from their daughter and son. She also threatened to harm him by involving her acquaintances. These were men she regularly met at bars, who were ready to commit crimes for her sake. Paul usually yielded to his wife in such situations and kept silent. The mysterious attack. On Sunday morning, June 20th, 2004, a frightened woman called the emergency services, pleading for help. She claimed that 3 strangers attacked her and her husband in their home, beating them, tying them up, attempting to rob them, and then driving away with their car, taking her husband with them. The caller was Jacqueline Crimble, and police officers and medics immediately rushed to the address she provided. At the house, they found a woman with her hands tied behind her back with a plastic cable tie. However, her legs were not bound, leading the authorities to believe she had managed to partially free herself. Notably, the victim had no injuries or bruises on her body, even though she initially claimed that the attackers had beaten and tied them up. Fortunately, the couple's children were not at home, as they had been sent to spend the weekend with their paternal grandparents. According to Jacqueline, the previous evening on Saturday, she and her husband had gone to a bar to relax. They drank and returned home after midnight. However, as Paul was opening the front door, 3 figures suddenly jumped out of the darkness and pushed them inside the house. The intruders, brandishing a gun, tied up the couple, beat them, and demanded money and prohibited substances. Allegedly, Paul tried to reason with the criminals, begging them to release him and his wife and promising not to call the police, but this only angered them. They hit him several times and then began to strangle him with a plastic bag in front of the terrified Jacqueline. When it became clear that there was no cash or prohibited substances in the house, the intruders decided to at least steal the car, but for some reason took the owner with them, leaving the bound woman behind. After the criminals drove away with Paul, Jacqueline managed to reach the phone and call the police using her tongue. She was sure her husband might still be alive and begged the detectives to find and save him immediately. However, despite her distress, the woman appeared and acted suspiciously calm, though the authorities had no reason to distrust her at that moment. The mutilated body in the trunk. The couple's car was immediately reported missing throughout the county, and investigators began collecting evidence at the crime scene. They tried to gather any details about the attackers, but Jacqueline claimed that the criminals wore masks. She couldn't recall any distinguishing features like clothing details, speech defects, limping, or anything similar. All she could say was that there were 3 of them, and they were men. By Monday morning, less than a day after the search began, the Crimble family car was found abandoned just 3 miles from the house where the attack had taken place. It was parked in a deserted alley next to a long vacant house. Inside the trunk was the mutilated body of its owner, bearing clear signs of beating and torture. The 35-year-old man's hands were tied behind his back, his legs bound with a cable tie, and his face and body covered with numerous bruises. When Jackie was informed of the gruesome discovery, she reacted surprisingly calmly. It seemed the brutal deprivation of her husband, the father of her children, didn't bother her much. She tried to feign surprise and pain but couldn't muster a single tear and literally asked when she would get her car back within a minute. This all appeared very suspicious, prompting law enforcement to take a closer look at the young widow. The main suspect. Initially, Jacqueline's version was not questioned and was considered the only credible account. However, the strange behavior of the widowed mother of two led law enforcement to suspect she might be lying. Soon it was revealed that her marriage to Paul had been falling apart for a long time, and she was never a model wife and mother. Not only neighbors and acquaintances spoke poorly of her, but even her children and parents. It also came to light that Jackie had been seeing a man named Roger Ferguson for several months. He owned a farm in Armagh where he lived with his mother. She and Crimble were often seen together in various entertainment venues in town, drinking alcohol. Moreover, Roger visited the married woman at her home when her husband was at work and the children were at school and daycare. Just the day after the car with the disfigured body was found, Jacqueline went from victim to the main suspect, and Roger was considered a possible accomplice. The woman did not appear to be a grieving widow and was much more concerned about getting her car back. Furthermore, her account of an attack by a gang of armed addicts sounded implausible. Nothing like this had ever happened in the quiet town before, and where had they gone after abandoning the vehicle with a body in the trunk? Additionally, the mysterious criminals managed to leave no traces, which was also strange. There were no other witnesses who saw suspicious strangers in town. However, almost everyone who ever interacted with the victim spoke negatively about her. Moreover, it soon emerged that the deceased man had an insurance policy, and his wife could expect a large payout of £300,000 sterling in the event of his passing. Now, a real motive had appeared in this case, which could explain the crime. Investigation into the crime. Jacqueline claimed she managed to call for help by dialing on a button phone with her tongue. The device was taken for examination, and indeed, traces of her saliva were found on it. However, at the initial crime scene inspection, investigators noted the phone was on the coffee table face down. With her hands tied behind her back, there was no way she could have turned it over after the call or dialed for help if it was in that position from the start. The couple's home computer search history revealed strange queries. Someone had been looking for information on life insurance, payout amounts, and procedures in the event of the policyholder's passing for months. When Jacqueline was directly asked about this, she said she knew nothing and suggested that perhaps Paul was interested in it. Roger Ferguson, who was considered a potential accomplice in the crime, had a rock-solid alibi. His mother claimed he spent the night at home because he wasn't feeling well, and around 1:30 in the morning, she was searching the home medicine cabinet for something to treat his stomach issues. Despite the elderly woman's convincing testimony, they didn't remove her son from the suspect list just yet. Police decided to track the suspect's locations on the night of the crime through their cell phone signals, discovering that Roger had not been home as his mother claimed. Instead, he was at the Crimbles' house, where he stayed for several hours. Additionally, he continued his relationship with the widowed woman, and they were seen together at a bar the day after Paul's funeral. Another curious detail was that Jacqueline and Roger visited a car dealership together, where they were looking at SUVs and inquiring about installment plans for such an expensive purchase. Roger's mother was even with them, which seemed even more suspicious. The police suspected that the lovers had already planned how they would spend the insurance payout after Paul's passing, and Roger's mother was likely aware. However, during interrogations, Jackie insisted she never cheated on her husband and certainly didn't wish him harm, but no one believed her anymore. Shortly before the tragedy, Jacqueline had started working as a caregiver in a nursing home, but lasted only a few weeks before being fired due to constant conflicts and lies. Nevertheless, She didn't tell her husband, continuing to pretend she was going to work or had night shifts while staying at Ferguson's house. The deception was accidentally revealed when Paul met one of his wife's former colleagues, who told him everything. He tried to talk to his wife, but this only sparked another argument. She threatened to leave him for her lover, take the children, and forbid their biological father from approaching them. This was Paul's biggest fear, so he agreed to compromise and turned a blind eye to her infidelity. He could only confide in his closest friend, who later testified in court as a witness, recounting Paul's words. The development and execution of a devious plan. Roger wasn't particularly smart. He was strong but somewhat simple-minded and easily led. Jacqueline quickly managed to completely dominate him, manipulating her lover to do her bidding. He would readily get into a fight for her, which flattered her immensely. He was likely genuinely in love with her and believed everything she said. The woman complained to Ferguson about her husband, accusing him of being rude, cruel, and even physically abusive. Naturally, this was all lies, but with each complaint, the lover grew to despise Paul more, believing he was harming and oppressing Jacqueline and was the main obstacle to their happiness together. She implanted the idea in his mind that by eliminating her husband, all their problems would be solved, allowing them to be together while receiving a substantial sum of money for a comfortable life. About 2 weeks before the tragedy, Mrs. Crimble tried to find people willing to commit the crime for money. But after considering several options, she and Roger abandoned the idea. It seemed the lovers decided they could carry it out themselves without leaving evidence or witnesses, ensuring they kept the entire insurance payout. On Friday, June 18th, Jacqueline took the children to stay with their grandparents for the weekend. On Saturday, she suggested that her husband go out for drinks to relax and talk. Paul gladly accepted the offer, thinking it might help their relationship. He didn't realize it was an invitation to his demise. That night, people in the bar noticed Jackie trying hard to get her non-drinking husband intoxicated. She bought drinks and practically forced him to knock back one shot after another, then led her staggering husband out of the bar after midnight. They were caught on surveillance cameras, and that was the last time Paul was seen alive. This revealed a significant timing discrepancy. The bar was a 10-minute walk from the couple's home, and the attack occurred immediately upon their return, lasting no more than 15 minutes, according to Jacqueline. After that, her husband was supposedly kidnapped and driven away in their car, and she immediately called the police. However, about an hour and a half elapsed between the time they were captured on camera and the call to the police. Investigators believed this time was spent by the perpetrators covering their tracks and staging the scene of an attack by third parties. Moreover, Jacqueline apparently intentionally got her husband drunk so he couldn't resist. According to her, the criminals kicked Paul while he was down, then began to strangle him by placing a plastic bag over his head and securing it with tape. The nature of the injuries on the deceased's body confirmed her account, but the police were nearly certain by then that the assailants were she and her lover, Ferguson. Incontrovertible evidence. After a long and thorough examination of the crime scene, detectives found a partially erased footprint of a man's shoe, which had been obviously attempted to be cleaned, but poorly. The tread pattern matched Roger's shoes, but this evidence could be considered circumstantial. However, there were other, more substantial pieces of evidence against the criminal couple. In the kitchen trash, a cigarette butt with Roger's saliva was found, and on the cable tie that bound Jacqueline's hands was a partial fingerprint of his. Moreover, on the ties binding the deceased's hands and feet, Ferguson's fingerprints were present, and on the bag used to suffocate the victim, sweat and oil traces of both lovers were found. The investigation also uncovered another participant in this brutal crime, a minor acquaintance of Roger named Colin Robinson. Roger called him on the night of the attack, asking for a favor to help with something unspecified. The teenager drove his car, left it at the end of the street at Roger's request, and walked to the house to avoid attracting attention. When Colin realized what was happening, he wanted to run, but Roger intimidated him and, by threatening with a knife, forced him to help move the body to the car and load it into the trunk. Afterward, They drove the car to a deserted place and abandoned it. Initially, the frightened young man denied his involvement in the crime, but he broke down during the second interrogation and began to confess. Trial and sentence. The investigation lasted several months. During this time, they gathered undeniable evidence, interviewed all witnesses, and obtained a confession from the third participant in the crime. However, the trial of the criminals only began in the spring of 2007, almost 3 years after Paul Crimble's deprivation of life. On May 7, 2007, Jacqueline and Roger were found guilty of a premeditated crime with the intent to obtain insurance money. The widow was sentenced to 20 years in prison, while her lover and accomplice received 18 years. The young accomplice, Colin Robinson, was sentenced to 3 years for assisting the criminals and attempting to cover up the truth. Roger's elderly mother also couldn't escape responsibility for perjury and providing a false alibi for her son. However, considering the woman's advanced age and her serious health problems, she was given only a year of probation. Revenge on her own children. Even in prison, Jacqueline continued to ruin her family's lives. She was angry that no one supported her in court and that everyone who knew her personally was relieved when she went behind bars. Even her own mother said that people like Jackie should be isolated from society forever so that they can't harm anyone. Interestingly, a few days after the funeral, Jacqueline burned all of her late husband's belongings and photos, so nothing in the house reminded her of him. Danielle somehow managed to save a couple of photos with her father. She kept them in her bedside table, and her mother simply didn't know about them. The insurance payout of £300,000, for which Paul was assassinated, went to his children. Danielle and Adam lost both parents overnight, but their troubles didn't end there. Their mother was adamantly against either her parents or the murdered husband's parents raising the children. She did everything to deprive them of guardianship rights, so the children ended up in foster care despite having living grandparents. At the time of the tragedy, Danielle was only 11, and her brother Adam was barely 5. Jacqueline managed to retain her parental rights and attempted to manipulate her children from prison. Specifically, she wanted them to publicly declare her innocence, using various pressure tactics. For example, she promised to sign permission for their school trips if they visited her in prison, but she deceived them. During the visit, she demanded they testify in her favor and refused to sign the document. As a result, the brother and sister were the only ones who couldn't go on weekend excursions with their class. Now Danielle is 31, living in Basingstoke, working in a daycare, and dating a man named Simon Bryce, who is an engineer. Her brother, now 25, has a good education and moved to London. Jacqueline is set to be released next year, and her adult children are seriously worried that their mother will continue to do everything possible to poison their lives. Thanks for watching, guys. Subscribe to my channel. There are many shocking stories ahead of you.